Basically, I want to talk about the prospective possibilities for the newly elected progressive governments in Bolivia, Chile, and Colombia in the context of a Latin American regional integration agenda. And with a special, perhaps stylized fact type quick analysis on not just the macroeconomic or financial policy that is usually more discussed in the context of IMF programs and the data that's available, but also with a read into the industrial policies in general. So what I propose is basically covering the regional integration agenda very quickly, and then talking about how each of these countries fits into the agenda with their domestic policies, and also with regards to the regional integration perspectives, right? So here we go. Now, the South American integration ideals have been laid out in different political instruments over basically 100, 200 years now. We're in the bicentennial of the independence. And the regional unity has always been an idea, a dream for many of the political leaders of our continent. In the first pink tide, it was an explicit policy agenda, an explicit issue that had a lot of support and a lot of interest. However, it was mostly a government-led or state-led integration agenda that didn't have all of the pillars within society, culture, and enterprises, the fabric, the productive fabric of our economies that would make it sustainable in time. So I want to propose, and these are sort of my perspectives on what the regional integration ideals should be. I would summarize them in the following. The 5 regional sovereignties: food sovereignty, energy and infrastructure sovereignty, health sovereignty, natural resources sovereignty. It's very important considering the insertion, the way South America has been inserted into the international system, and knowledge sovereignty. And this is crucial, and I will get into this a bit more. Then the 3 commons, which is a common defense policy, common market. We have to take into account that Mercosur, which is the name of the regional integration project in the southern cone of South America, is actually, it actually stands for Mercado Común del Sur, so Southern Common Market. And it shows how the neoliberal integration agenda in the 90s prioritized the market over all of the other issues. And then we have a common monetary integration project, right? And then finally, one union, which is UNASUR. It's important because in South America, we have evolved from a project of community of countries to one of union of countries. And that decision, of course, was political and happened in the first pink tide. And it had the okay of the right-wing governments of the region at the time as well. So it was not just a progressive government kind of thing. It was also supported by the right-wing governments of the era, including the Colombian President Uribe and the Paraguayan President Duarte, and even the Chilean President Piñera. So that's something very important to take into account. Now, how do we do this regional integration? Well, it was laid out that UNASUR would be the framework where all of this would happen. It was a treaty that was ratified by other parliaments and so on, and started operating with its regional seat, the headquarters in Quito, Ecuador, my home country. And we had a South American different councils of ministers for each of their respective areas for planning and infrastructure, energy, defense, education, science, technology, electoral policy, health, and so on. There were sectoral arrangements so that the ministers could meet several times a year and laid out the different agendas. We had several other instruments like the South American Institute for Health Governance that was based in Rio de Janeiro, and it was in charge of basically coordinating health policy, but also medicine production. They came up with an entire map of production of medicines in South America so that we could come up with a regional import substitution strategy and a regional value chain distribution strategy where each country could perhaps specialize in the production of certain medicines and vaccines for the distribution in the rest of the region. We also had the Bank of the South, which is a project that I was aborted. Unfortunately, did not see the light of day. I was the director from Ecuador, and we worked a lot. We developed an entire agenda. All the paperwork was finished, but we lacked that final push when the first wave of the pink tide started to recede. So we were caught in excessive bureaucracy, too long time. It took too long to set it up, and well, there are many other reasons why. We can get into that in the questions. But basically, this was designed to not to finance individual country projects, but regional projects, right? So, for example, if we wanted to build a multi-country oil pipeline or a natural gas pipeline, or if we wanted to build an interconnected electricity system, or if we wanted to manage rivers that are in different countries and so on. This is the kind of thing that the Bank of the South would finance, and also would become this agent for regional projects that in the past was a role that was occupied by the Inter-American Development Bank in Washington, D.C. Believe it or not, most of the regional projects that South American countries agree on are financed and developed in Washington, D.C. in the Inter-American Development Bank. And now a new element of this regional integration agenda has come out, which is the Central Bank of the South, proposed by Lula and his team in Brazil, and has raised a lot of expectations in the region. And I'm basically transposing some of the proposals from the Lula team, which is a common and endogenous unit of account. So not a currency that replaces national currencies, but a unit of account that can be used for intra-regional trade, developing an intra-regional payment system that would allow for real-time payments amongst ourselves without having to go through New York or Miami banks, and common capital account regulations, which would be the heterodox component of such a project. Of course, these are very key issues, very important, and that require a lot of consensus building and so on, but we don't have too much time to lose regarding this in the new wave of the pink tide. Now, there are many other possible projects that can be laid out for quick and profound integration, and taking some of this from the agenda that the Bank of the South preparatory commissions had been working on. And one is to set up the Knowledge Fund for the South, which is the equivalent of these large research funding programs for basically engineering and projects related to the regional sovereignty mega projects, including tech transfer with partners. So in the cases where the knowledge base to design the engineering for this project is not available within the region, you can partner with outside institutions, universities, companies, and so on, but with relevant tech transfer clauses so that the knowledge can be retained within the country and future projects can also be developed domestically. Also, a culture education and higher education program, we called it the Erasmus of the South, where we could have millions of scholarships for intra-regional exchange students that did not really have to increase public expenditure, because students that go to public universities would still go to public universities, but a different country, and those of that country could go to another one, and in a multilateral clearing system, you would have no further expenditure except for perhaps travel costs, because the idea is that they would live also within families and would allow for deep profound regional integration at the popular level, at the people level. And we think this is key to make a regional integration project sustainable. Recall that we're in a region that basically shares all the same cultural traits, even language, religion, and so on. So it is very easy to push forward a regional agenda, and it's actually a mystery why it hasn't been so much more profound in the past. Also, request ecological debt to be paid to the indigenous peoples and the states that they live in, putting the Andes in the Amazon biodiversity, taking advantage of the Nagoya Protocol, indigenous value chains, and different derivatives of biological and genetic resources that are available in our region. And this, we think, is important to propose an agenda of how South America can be inserted into the world system, considering a greener perspective and considering the rich biodiversity that it offers to the world. Also, a natural resource export associations, you can call them cartels if you want, because we need to be explicit about improving the terms of trade. When Hugo Chavez became the president of Venezuela, oil was trading at $9 per barrel. He was explicit in traveling to the Middle East, meeting with OPEC members, and basically a renewal of OPEC that had been asleep for a couple of decades. And so he played an explicit role there in reviving OPEC. And we think we can also have a soy cartel, a lithium cartel, a copper cartel, a coca cartel, and protein cartels because of the relative share that South American countries have in the world markets. And then finally, a joint procurement for technological disaggregation and technological transfer. We have studies, of course, they are on a general level, but on initiatives on joint procurement of medicine, of agricultural inputs, of capital goods that can be purchased together, with a multi-year aggregate demand of the different fiscal savings, but will lead the way for proactive industrial policy and investment promotion in the region. So all of these are projects for quick and profound integration without actual large new public expenditure or messing with the deficits and so on. Now, some key issues in the regional integration agenda has always been, well, what do we do now about the community of Latin American and Caribbean states? Are we going to stick to that? Are we going to also belong to the OAS and the Inter-American system that's based in DC, in Washington, DC? Or are we truly going to build a regional integration project based in the South? How, from the South American perspective, are we going to do this with or without Mexico? Remember, Mexico has been speaking in the last year or so about, basically reviving the FTAA, the Free Trade Area of the Americas. Is that Mexico's agenda, or is that the Western Hemisphere agenda that comes from elsewhere? Can we improve the regional integration agenda considering Anglophone and Dutch-speaking Caribbean countries? Should we start with the free trade, or should we end with free trade after we have infrastructure, after we have energy, after we have the actual elements that make trade possible? And then how to make it sustainable at the popular level, at the business level, at the academic and elites level, and so on. And also a big deal out of regional financial architecture, which has been very difficult in putting it in place because of the power of the large correspondent banks, basically based in the United States and Western Europe. So there's a lot to do, and fortunately there are people thinking about these issues, perhaps not enough, and we need champions of the regional integration agenda. Now, I'm going to analyze these countries' progressive governments with a stylized assessment. I don't have the time to get into many of the quantitative issues. They are implicitly discussed, but I will evaluate industrial policy, central bank policy, and their limits, or how they are limiting finance-based regime, the finance-based regime of accumulation.
You have 5 more minutes.
yeah, their perspectives with regards to international trade and the possibilities of sovereign delinking from a sort of inferior position in the hierarchy, and commitment to this regional integration agenda that I just mentioned. Quickly, Bolivia, it's perhaps the only country out of the three that has an explicit long-term development planning industrial policy. They have achieved the largest growth in the region, and consistently large growth as well, even in the moments of crisis that have happened around the world and in the region. They have an active central bank policy. This is not well studied. The central bank funds state-owned firms, so they have expanded their balance sheet, not for financialization purposes, but for actual industrial policy purposes. It's pretty interesting in the 21st century. They have also Bolivianized the financial system by de-dollarizing deposits and loans, basically completely now at the level of 95% or more. Nationalization of natural resources in 2008 was key, not only because of everything that entails, but also it's a pillar for fiscal stability and investment, public investment. They are very proactive about the relative prices within the economy. They are not afraid to regulate and fix prices. And also they negotiate their terms of trade explicitly with the countries that buy their hydrocarbons. There's a story there about how when Evo Morales nationalized the oil fields and the gas fields, there was a small risk of retaliation by the Brazilian Petrobras and the Brazilian government, but fortunately they finally accepted Bolivia's terms, and it laid out a nice input for a transformative agenda in Bolivia. And they terminated all of their bilateral investment treaties. They don't have any FTAs except regional trade treaties, and they are definitely committed to regional integration, obviously seeking differential treatment considering that they are a small economy. In the case of Chile, what we'll see depends a lot on a vote that will happen a month from now, which is a vote, the referendum, whether the new constitution will be passed or not. The new constitution includes heterodox objectives for the central bank. It's perhaps going to be the first central bank that at the constitutional level will include ecological objectives. So that's pretty interesting and forward-looking. There is a tax reform, which is crucial that it passed later this year, so that the redistributive agenda that President Boric is and the winning party wants to propose, this tax reform has to pass. It's another key measure there. The pension system will be mostly deprivatized, and that it's important because it will decrease the degree of financialization of the Chilean economy, right? I mean, the development of the Chilean securities and stock market was basically a consequence of the privatization of the pension system. And there's talk of creating a lithium association with Argentina, Bolivia, and Mexico. Mexican president has proposed this, but it is unlikely that it will happen in the current conditions. We'll see what else shall happen. We need a bigger champion of this. The left-wing part of the coalition pushed for more aggressive constitutional text that would have undone the international trade treaties' worst chapters, especially the investor-state dispute settlement chapters. Unfortunately, this did not pass in the draft constitution, so it will depend now on the executive branch and how they manage that situation.
1 minute, please.
Yep, I'm almost, and then Chile will have a slow, ambivalent approach to regional integration, and however, the demographics in Chile, basically the youth, is leading the change. And then finally, Colombia, the co-authors of the progressive 1991 constitution will finally have a chance to govern. I'm talking about Petro and his Pacto Histórico. Peace is the imperative in Colombia, and the role of the drug trade is crucial in that country, and the solution has to be at the level of the Western Hemisphere. Petro understands that the central bank should coordinate with the state and will have a much more proactive role in the economy. Tax reform is also crucial in Colombia, just like in Chile, but I haven't seen signs that tax reform will also be an industrial policy instrument. The pension system will be significantly deprivatized, also decreasing financialization of the domestic economy. So we'll see some complaints there by the financial capital around the world. Petro has promised no fossil fuels, but that will not be radical. It will undergo a moderate transition. Amazon conservation will be at the center. Petro wants a renegotiation of the US FTA, but that's unlikely to prosper from the US side. However, they will probably just close their eyes whenever he wants to implement certain protectionist policies. And then finally, Colombia will be seeking a leading role in the regional integration agenda. This is very important because Colombia plays a key geostrategic role from the perspective of the United States in the region. So it's good that Colombia will be an active participant in the regional integration agenda. If Colombia shows the way, many in the region will follow, especially including Chile. And definitely in the region, if Lula wins and Lula is very proactive about regional integration, we can have that actually happening because Brazil's leadership is key in our region. Thank you.